According to legend, the city of Rome was founded on April 21st, 753 BC, after the city's namesake Romulus murdered his brother for the crime of wanting to name it Rame. For the next millennium or so, nothing of interest happened. They built some cool looking stuff, they conquered some land, and became one of the largest and most influential empires in history, yada yada, no one cares. Until, in 476, Odoacer deposed the ironically named Emperor Romulus Augustus, and the Roman Empire fell, or at least its western half did. While Rome, the empire, was no more, Rome, the city, continued to exist, albeit with a lot less status and grandeur than it had before. So what happened to the city after the fall? Well, for the first few years at least, nothing much changed. Life went on, the Senate still convened, the city remained Christian, and Odoacer ruled with the explicit permission of Zeno, the emperor of Rome's eastern half. This approval did not save Rome and Odoacer from being invaded and killed by Theodoric, again with permission from Zeno. Still, Rome's Roman identity stayed intact, and many temples and monuments were renovated. He even managed to pull some diplomatic trickery to regain control over the Visigoth, Burgundy, and Vandal kingdoms. This period of growth was short-lived. In 535, Theodoric's daughter and successor Amalasuntha was killed, and the Byzantines launched their reconquest of Italy. Over the next couple decades, the Ostrogoths and Byzantines were involved in a tug-of-war over Rome, which ended in a Byzantine victory, but a decisive loss for the city itself. Rome fell into ruin, was sacked, and forcefully abandoned. By the end of the Gothic War, the city's population had fallen from over 1 million to a measly 30,000. The Byzantines couldn't enjoy their victory for long, as the Lombards conquered the Italian peninsula not long after. While Rome officially remained in Byzantine hands, it was under heavy Lombard influence. During this period, the Roman Church grew in power and influence. The lack of direct Byzantine control over Rome created an opportunity for the Pope to grow from just a religious leader into something resembling a king. This process was helped when in the 8th century, the Lombards kicked the Byzantines out of the Roman province and donated the lands to the Pope. In return, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. With the power of God on its side, the city started to rebuild. As it turns out, being the seat of power of one of the world's largest religions comes with some perks. The city's cash reserves grew through donations, taxing every single church in Europe, selling get-out-of-hell free cards, and becoming a tourist trap for pilgrims. This money was used to restore and refit old ruins and to build grand new churches. And this is how things remained for the next few centuries, with Pope in charge of Rome and Rome in charge of the Papal States of central Italy, give or take a few sackings. But while the lines on the map did not change much, Rome saw heavy internal conflict as many rich and powerful families fought for even more riches and power. These petty squabbles went all the way to the top. Not even Rome's holiest man was safe, as the papacy itself was full of bribery and nepotism. Take, for example, Pope Benedict IX. In 1032, he became the Pope through bribery, but was eventually kicked out due to his many rapes, murders, and other unspeakable acts of violence and sodomy. That's a direct quote from a later Pope, by the way. Benedict was obviously not happy with this, especially since he had paid an ungodly amount of money to obtain a position, and in 1044 he returned to Rome to dispose of his successor, Pope Sylvester III. Just a couple of months later, however, he decided that he wanted to marry his cousin, so he abdicated and sold the position to his godfather, Gregory VI, only to change his mind again a couple of months later. At this point, Benedict, Sylvester, and Gregory all claimed to be the rightful pope. A meeting was called, and a fourth pope, Clement II, was selected as the actual pope for real this time. Clement proceeded to die a couple of months later, and Benedict returned to Rome to once again reclaim his position as pope. He was now, for the fourth and final time, replaced, this time by Damasus II, and was excommunicated from the church for good measure. Less complicated, but maybe even more ridiculous, was Pope Stephen VI. He really disliked one of his predecessors, Pope Formosus. He disliked him so much, in fact, that he wanted to have him trialed and executed. There was only one tiny problem. Formosus had been dead for almost a full year. This did not deter Stephen, as he had Formosus' corpse dug up and put on trial. Formosus lost on account of being dead and therefore unable to defend himself, and his corpse was weighted down and thrown into the Tiber River. And then there was Pope Alexander VI, who liked watching horses fuck. With the papacy being up to all of this bullcrap, it is no wonder that in July 1054, the Eastern Orthodox Church split off from Catholicism. Also around this time, the papacy, or at least some version of it, moved to Avignon in France for roughly 70 years. This unexpected papal excursion left Rome with a significant power vacuum. The Pope had hardly left the driveway before the city's aristocratic families, most notably the Colonna and Orsini, began to fight each other and themselves for the right to step up as Rome's new leader. While two dogs fought for Rome, Cola di Rienzo ran away with it. He managed to gain the support of both the Roman people and the Pope and crowned himself as Tribune of Rome. Cola was not just an ordinary ruler. Oh no, Cola had a dream. He wished to restore Rome to its former glory and reunite the Italian peninsula under its rule. He came somewhat close to completing this first part of his dream, albeit by becoming a tyrant, but he failed spectacularly at reuniting the country, and then got driven out of the city for good measure. But hey, -1 out of 2 ain't bad. He returned to a leadership position again a decade later, but only lasted a month before being kicked out once again. Not long after, Pope Gregory XI returned the papacy to Rome and peace returned to the city. Psych! Gregory died barely a year later, which led to a huge mess. Both Avignon and Rome elected a new pope, and both claimed that the other guy was a traitor devil worshipper who was going to burn in hell for all of eternity. The two sides continued to fight with each other for several decades. Eventually, their supporters grew tired of the bickering and came to the realization that both popes were equally annoying. They came together in the Council of Pisa and elected a third pope in order to solve the problem. Unsurprisingly, this did nothing to actually solve the problem, and now there were 3 popes running around claiming that they were the real one. On April 6, 1415, another meeting was held, which resulted in the Roman pope resigning, the Pisan pope being deposed, and the Avignon pope being excommunicated. Pope Martin V was elected, and peace returned to the city. This period of relative stability coincided with the Renaissance. Under the rule of Martin V and his successors, Rome began to rebuild, and then some. The city hired several of the Ninja Turtles to engineer the city's transformation. Famous works such as St. Peter's Basilica, Palazzo Farnese, and the Sistine Chapel, among many others, were built, and the city finally seemed to be restored to its former glory. Knock knock. Who's there? It's the sound of Martin Luther hammering the 15th century equivalent of a note screenshot to a German church door. Martin Luther, along with plenty of other Christians, had by now grown tired of the papacy's bullcrap and decided to start their own version of Christianity, this time without blackjack and hookers. One important part of this reformation was giving access to the holy text to the people via the newly invented printing press. This democratization of knowledge quickly led to Christianity splitting into dozens of slightly different variations, which immediately started fighting amongst each other, and more importantly, with the papacy. Not that Rome had the time to worry about one angry German monk, as several angry Germans were busy sacking the city. Again. In the early decades of the 16th century, Rome, France, Venice, and the Holy Roman Empire, which by now was neither holy nor Roman and barely an empire, were busy fighting over control of northern Italy in a confusing mess of constantly changing alliances. This was all fun and games until suddenly German Emperor Charles V also became leader of Habsburg Spain and now controlled both the northern and southern part of the Italian peninsula. Pope Clement VII obviously did not like this and told the Habsburgs to go fuck themselves, which they happily did. This did not stop them from attacking Rome, however, and soon a 34,000 strong German-Spanish army came knocking down the papacy's doors. All of these 34,000 soldiers needed to be paid, and Charles was in no mood to spend his own money. Instead, they were told to march on Rome and take whatever they wanted as payment. The ransacking went on for 8 months and only stopped when the city ran out of things to plunder. Then they had a plague outbreak for good measure. This marked the end of the Roman Renaissance, and the city's population dropped to below 10,000 inhabitants. But Rome did what it always does and rebuilt. In response to the Protestant Reformation, Catholicism had a counter-reformation, which resulted in some reforms to the church and a heavy focus on producing art. Where the Protestants focused on spreading the word of God through the power of books, the Catholics chose to wage their propaganda war by producing mind-blowing works of art at even more mind-blowing quantities. As it turns out, I'm not immune to propaganda, and all of this art was almost enough to distract me from the nepotistic bullshit the papacy was up to. Almost. While Rome was busy rebuilding, France was doing, well, the opposite of that, as they violently dismantled the country's monarchy and turned itself into a republic. When the French had gotten bored of cutting off their own heads, they set their sights on the rest of the continent, starting with Italy. Their armies came rushing down the peninsula and they established the Roman Republic, which is really just France with a fake mustache. The Republic was briefly freed by Neapolitan troops, only to immediately afterwards be invaded and annexed by Napoleon. After 5 failed and 1 almost successful attempt, the 7th coalition, consisting of almost every European nation that wasn't France, finally managed to get rid of Napoleon for good and returned the Papal States to Roman control. Although the French were driven out of Italy, the Italian nationalism and revolutionary spirit they had instilled remained. Their hopes of a unified Italy were bolstered in 1846 when Pope Pius IX was elected, as he was a liberal and sympathetic to their ideals. In 1848, the revolution became the hot new trend in Europe, and the Italians, always fashionable, could not be left behind. In Rome, the Republic of Rome was established and Pope Pius was forced to flee. The revolution was suppressed with some French help, and Pius returned, now a lot less favorable towards the revolutionaries. They were not to be deterred though, and in 1859 the Second Italian War of Independence broke out. This resulted in the Italian kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia taking control of almost all of northern Italy. Not much later, an uprising kicked off in Sicily, and an Italian force consisting of only 1,000 men marched in and took the island, and then moved on to invade Naples and finally the Papal States, but not Rome, which remained under French protection. Despite this, they still named Rome as the capital of the newly formed Kingdom of Italy, thereby announcing their intention to retake the city when the opportunity presented itself. This moment finally arrived in 1870, when the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War meant that France had to reroute its troops from Rome to the new front line, leaving the city ripe for the taking. Rome was quickly incorporated into Italy. Well, mostly at least. You see, the Pope was not happy with losing all of his territory, so he decided to lock himself up in Vatican Hill, and he dared the Italians to come and get him. Italy was a mostly Catholic nation, so they knew that forcefully capturing the Pope would be a bad look and cause unrest in a still young nation. Instead, they decided to simply ignore the Pope and wait him out. And they kept waiting, for several decades and multiple generations of popes without any sign of progress. The waiting was momentarily halted when World War I broke out. The war brought devastation across Europe, but left Rome relatively unharmed, which means we don't have to talk about it here. Soon after the war, Benito Mussolini was first democratically elected as prime minister, and then very undemocratically made it so he could stay prime minister. Mussolini finally gave up on waiting out the papacy and signed a treaty giving it control over Vatican City. In return, the Pope would officially recognize the Italian state and promise to remain neutral in case of war. Not that that would ever happen. Like many before him, Mussolini had a dream of restoring the Roman Empire. In the 1930s, he won some smaller wars, which left Italy with slightly more land but significantly less money. This meant that it was entirely unprepared when the Second World War broke out, which did not stop Mussolini from teaming up with the Nazis. For the first half of the war, Rome was mostly spared from conflict, mainly because of the presence of the Vatican City within its borders. But in 1943, Allied bombing raids of the city began. At the same time, the Allies had begun their invasion of Sicily and were steadily moving their way up the peninsula. As a result of this, Mussolini was removed from power after a vote of no confidence and imprisoned, and Italy pulled on Italy and switched sides. Soon after his arrest, Mussolini was freed by Nazi troops and installed as the head of the Italian Social Republic, a Nazi puppet state which included Rome as its de jure capital. The Allies, however, kept slowly advancing up the peninsula. By June 1944, Rome was liberated, and by April 1945, Mussolini saw the writing on the wall and attempted to flee to Switzerland. He was caught on the way by the Italian resistance, executed, and strung up by his ankles. Not long after, the war ended and the monarchy was abandoned following a referendum, resulting in the creation of the modern-day Italian Republic. Which brings us to today. Well, almost. In the period following the war, Rome did what we have seen it do so many times already and rebuilt. In what we now know as the Italian economic miracle, Rome once again re-established itself as one of Europe's premier cities. And this is a central theme throughout Rome's history. All the way back in the 1st century BC, the poet Tibullus already referred to Rome as the Eternal City, and this is a very fitting nickname. We have seen a city that has gone through some of the highest of highs and lowest of lows. A city that has endured whatever history threw at it and always managed to persevere and rebuild. A city that has truly stood the test of time. Thank you for watching. I've been Thomas, and I hope to see you next video where I'll talk about some hills. Exciting stuff, I know. Hiya.